and welcome to Life at Noon. My name is Rachel Hugenberg. I am the host, and today I am also the presenter. So, we are talking about one of my favorite things, just like we were chatting a bit before we had gotten started, about doodling. Because doodling actually has a lot of different psychological implications. So, it's not just our favorite things or what we doodle, it also activates certain centers in the mind. And it's something that I've been fascinated by since the time I was, absolutely tiny and could pick up a pencil and draw. And I think it's something that brings out the creativity and the positivity in all of us and lets us just kind of escape into images and our own set of things that we might want to aspire to. Now, I did not draw this front doodle, but as you can see, doodles can be kind of chaotic. They're not necessarily really organized. And that's a part of their joy, and that's a part of their beauty. So we're going to be talking about doodling and the brain. So what on earth is a doodle? Some people say, okay, it's a dog, like a golden doodle, or it's like Yankee Doodle, which that is actually part of the origin of the word. Is doodle meant to waste time, to fritter about, to be stupid, or to be foolish. And that was a much older definition of doodle. It has actually changed. Modern connotations here, Yankee Doodle aside, sort of absent-mindedly drawing nonsense symbols, designs, and figures, but in a more comprehensive definition, it can be said that doodling is unconscious designing while no attention is paid by the person. So this is actually our unconscious mind spilling out onto the paper and showing us what we may subconsciously be trying to connect with. There's another definition of doodle, though, that I actually like much better, which is Suni Brown's definition of doodle, and we actually do have this book. It is called The Doodle Revolution, and she is one of the people who started the idea of the doodle revolution and brought doodling kind of into the forefront of being studied and being understood by scientists. And she says that to doodle is to make spontaneous marks to help you think with your mind and body. And being a kinesthetic learner, that really clicks with me. The idea that we are doodling something to connect. So we talked about some of the older origins of the word doodle. Where on earth did the modern version of this word come into play, right? So it actually came into play in the 1920s and got popularized in the 1930s. And there at that time, we may not necessarily think about doodling and psychology. Sometimes we do, but there's actually inherent in the word doodle in the modern meaning some psychological implications and ties, because when this doodling craze was coming out and everybody wanted to see famous celebrities doodles and cartooning and all kinds of things that were really taking off during this time, it was also the time period where Sigmund Freud and Jung and psychology were also really starting to expand and explode and kind of get in with everything. And one of the things that Freud and Jung both talk about is drawings, doodles, and dreams are all part of their psychological analysis. And in answer to the question, who doodles anyway? Honestly, I think everybody does. And that's the fascinating thing, because it's something that anybody can do. There's not a wall around doodling in the same way that there are more skills-based types of art and artistic expression. Doodling is just something that all of us do, even if we're not even thinking about it. So, when did doodling actually start? As you can kind of see here, this is a wonderful, lovely cave painting. And cave paintings were an early expression, but as we can see this zigzag here, they put decoration on their drawings. there are things that there's not really a purpose for them being there in terms of a meaning. It's just they doodled. They wanted to enjoy, they were thinking about something. Now, in the Middle Ages, a lot of monks would make these very ornate books, and it took a long time, and you got very bored because something like this, a page might take an entire day. So you're naturally going to zone out, right? Well, there's a formal name for these kinds of doodles, and they're actually called marginalia, because they're drawn in the margins. So it's the idea of you're just kind of doodling away in the free space here. And a lot of the marginalia includes these sort of witty or just a little bit naughty kind of doodle that's a little bit odd or quirky. And it gives us a chance to look at what medieval people actually zoned out and created subconsciously. You know, this is what they were supposed to be writing according to the script, but what the doodles in the marginalia say is a whole different story. And some of the marginalia doodles are really wild. Look them up sometime. They're really entertaining. Sorry, one of the world's most famous doodlers. So these are both by Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, so this is a point where we're going to talk about the difference between scribbling and sketching and drawing and doodling. So scribbling came a little bit before the origin of doodling, and it served basically a similar purpose. Sketching is a more formalized type of drawing, and drawing is obviously the idea of creating a specific image. You know, you're trying to generate some kind of feeling with the image. So it's very deliberate. So as we can see here, we have two different ones for comparison. This is one of Da Vinci's drawings of the Virgin, which was a frequently asked for theme at the time. You can see there's very detailed shading and tinting and crossovers with the line work. These are just some of Da Vinci's sketchbook, like his notebooks. He would just quick doodle people all the time, friends, lovers, people he saw on the street. And he doodled a lot of his inventions too. A lot of really famous inventors, including Da Vinci, Einstein, Edison, Tesla, they all doodled. Steve Jobs. Yeah, they're all doodlers, guys. So obviously there's something to the idea that doodling really gets the brain going. So like we talked about, there's a lot of connections with Freud and Jung. So, you know, when we came in, we were sort of early on, we were chatting about what do you doodle most frequently? What do these things possibly mean? That's actually connected to a pseudoscience, the word pseudo, called graphology, which means it originated as looking at the handwriting of someone and analyzing it and seeing what it said about them. And that crossed over into looking at a person's drawings, because this is a form of visual language, yes, and seeing what that meant. So it's all in our unconscious mind with doodling. It's not something that we're doing as a deliberate, you know, choice according to Freud and Jung and some of the origins. It's something that just kind of floats about in our heads as we do things. Now, as to whether doodles really do have symbolism or not, I think that's a really debatable question, because it can be really changeable. If you look for the meanings of drawing flowers, it changes sometimes, because if it's very circular, that's assumed to be friendly or outgoing. But if you're drawing something very angular and incredibly detailed, say like a rose that's very pointed, that might say, you know, that you're very sharp, that you may not be able to relate as well to others. It may just mean that you like drawing spiky roses. it leaves it up for debate as to whether there is or is not symbolism behind what people want to put on the page. Okay, so this is where we get into some of the real psychology, and you can actually see a picture of a human brain here of what's called the DMN. Now, this has been talked about in psychology for a little while now, and it's actually called our default mode network. So this is what is in charge of our routine, our autopilot type of action. So when you get in the car and you're eating your granola bar and you're checking your purse and, you know, doing your day-to-day routine and you don't really remember it, that's your DMN taking over and saying, okay, I can handle this. I'll take this one. And it's also in charge of daydreaming. So this is the center of where we daydream, where we kind of unfocus and think about maybe what we want to be. What are the possibilities? It is also our memory processor. So you will hear the DMN talked about a lot when we talk about memory-oriented diseases like Alzheimer's. And it's also our worry center. So when you're not thinking about anything and you're bored and then a worry suddenly pops up and you have to think about it and, you know, process that, that's also your DMN. So when you're doodling, it actually activates these specific brain centers and it allows your mind to wander a little bit. You can still focus on what you're doing, but it gives you a little bit of relief from the pressure and it gives you a little bit of space. The guy who talks about this has a PhD and his name is Pillay. He's actually really interesting. He talks a lot about psychology and the sciences. So where does all this talk about doodling even come from? Well, in science, it came back 2009 with Andrade, who was the originator of a study. And what she basically had people do was doodle while they listened to the world's most boring list of phone message to see if they could pick up some details. Okay. And the people who doodled actually remembered more and did better in terms of recall, which is something that I don't know about you, but I got told that doodling really makes you a little bit more unfocused in the classroom and that you're not thinking about what you're doing, but that actually has been disproven to a certain extent. It does actually help. Now, if you're trying to manage visual tasks, because doodling is a visual language, you know, we're looking at images, we're putting them together and we're trying to see how they relate. Swirly thing, toaster, microphone, how do these relate to each other? In this case, they don't, but sometimes they do, in the sense of, say, emojis. It forms a visual language. Happy faces, sad faces, we can doodle all of these very easily. Okay. And Andrade is wanting to prove that doodling increases your focus. Some people disagreed because if you're trying to pay attention to a visual presentation at the same time that you're doodling, your brain is trying to multitask and the brain is not necessarily so great at that. But Suni Brown actually talks about this in The Doodle Revolution, which is a great book, by the way. It's really funny and down to earth and just sharp. She discusses doodling as a conscious choice, that we can actually take doodling into our own hands and use it for focusing ourselves. And there was actually a really famous professor of, I think it was biochemistry, who had been failing her biochem class and absolutely struggling with it. And she started doodling and she started making small doodles of the material. And all of a sudden she started remembering it more, much in the style that a lot of people do now with bullet journaling, where they'll add doodles or they will add decoration into it to make the page more interesting and to catch their eye. And she was more focused and she actually started having her students do this and it improved grades. So doodling can help you focus, especially if it's a conscious choice. Now, that's if you don't get too caught up in the doodle. If you get so caught up in the doodle that you're not paying attention, that's a different story. But there are 3 forms of doodling that get talked about a lot, which are Zen doodling, info doodling, and meta doodling. So Zen doodling, you've probably seen these types of images before. You can even get them as coloring pages if you would like. You may have heard of Zentangles, such as our Zentangle Tuesday guide, in which Chrissy, our wonderful children's librarian, has created some Zentangles that you can actually do. And you can follow the instructions on them and make the doodle yourself. So the whole point of Zentangles is the idea of putting sort of a meditation into action, in finding our Zen, our inner sort of calm, if you will. And it's about drawing a pattern repeatedly over and over until you create something. That's actually one of the reasons that adult coloring is so popular now too, is because it takes over that center of the brain that lets us unfocus. The DMN kind of lets us unfocus on what's going on around us a little bit and gives us some relief from our day-to-day life pressures. And the amazing thing about Zen doodles is they're very simplistic in their drawing, in that it is more challenging than it looks, but anyone can draw it, because if you break it down, you're drawing just basic shapes and patterns repeatedly over and over. And if you're struggling with coming up with your own and creating them, I highly recommend Chrissy's Zentangles. They're really awesome. And it puts you into kind of a state of meditation almost. Okay, so info doodling. I don't know if you guys have seen images similar to this before, but this has become really popular in a lot of videos and educational classroom settings. And this is another Sunny Brown idea, which is that, one, people can doodle as a group. It's not just something you have to do alone. If you're in a meeting and all of you are stuck, she suggests doing an info doodle where you break it down into the processes, into the systems, into the comparisons between things. You know, you actually draw out that an apple looks different than an orange, or that the process of putting gas in your car starts with pull up to gas station, insert card, select gas, you know, etc. Systems, meaning like more of a focus on how the overall picture works. So it actually does give us a really great visual image to click with these more complicated ideas. And I think, honestly, info doodling is very related to infographics. They're not directly related, but I would say that they're cousins. So let's take a look. She actually offers classes in info doodling. So this is an info doodle that she presents as being really exemplary, and it's combinations of words and images all together talking about the process of where they want things to go and how they want things to work. Okay, this last one, I will admit I had not heard of this one before I had done some research on doodling, because it is actually part of the art world. So I love me some art, and especially some abstract art. Wassily Kandinsky is a favorite artist of mine, because his whole idea is it's nonsense. It doesn't have to make sense. And that is actually the thing that's going on with meta doodling, which is these artists, Scotty Wilson, who was part of the Outsiders movement, and Unica Zern, actually took their doodles and just sort of went from this automatic process of, okay, my hand and my brain are having a relationship and I'm thinking about what I'm doing and I want to produce something really cool. Let me just come up with something. And they repeatedly drew these patterns over and over again. And their artwork in a way forms what's called a metadoodle, meaning it's sort of that next level of doodling, that they took this unconscious part of the brain and brought it back to art. And I think it's pretty amazing that, you know, all of these are things that we might see in art and doodling now, but that metadoodles have become a real big part of the art world and a part of our, I beg your pardon, our societal focus. So the idea that you can take just a normal, ordinary doodle and make it into art and take it to the next level is pretty astounding. And there were a lot of different artists at the time who got involved with doing this as a movement. Okay, so mental health is one of my big passions. And so I researched just about all the different techniques that go on with improving mental health and making, you know, positive changes to your life and that sort of thing. So I wanted to know, what does doodling have to do with mental health? Does it have to do with anything? Sometimes they say that our doodles reflect our mental health. So if we're drawing a lot of crosses or X's, that can mean that you're closed off to things. You know, if you're doodling fences or houses with no windows, that means you feel shut in. So it's something to think about, is, do our doodles tell us something? And that is something that comes across in a lot of art therapy, is having kids or even adults draw and doodle, and seeing what comes out on the page is that form of expression. So there's actually a psychologist in the UK who has created an account here, as you can see, called Tiny Mind Doodles. And it's the idea that cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a way of commonly coping with disorders like depression and anxiety and major stress, can actually be done through the form of doodling. So she actually takes these really lovely doodles that she makes, and she has a way that you can actually go along with her. So you can actually repeat after her and do the doodles and practice them and do the basic shapes. And she does a really good job of taking doodles to that kind of next level with CBT. Now, we mentioned earlier that Zentangles can be a form of meditation, right? So there are actually step-by-step guides out there on how to use doodling and drawing as forms of meditation. I particularly liked this one. It takes you step by step, and we actually have books at the library on how to do this. For going through the process. And this is one of the things that is commonly said about doodling, and one of the reasons why I love it so much is because it's not about being perfect. That was something that I ran across in just about everything that talked about doodling, was that anybody can do this and it doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. So it's about finding relaxation. They actually borrowed from Bob Ross here on happy accidents, but it's the idea of, you can take something as simple as a pen and paper and use it as a meditation exercise if you struggle with auditory meditation or being very still during meditation. And note it takes you through the process from beginning to end here on how to do this. And there are 1,000 different videos on YouTube, as well as guides that have a meditative environment intended to get you through actually drawing this concept for yourself. So doodling can be a form of creative expression, like we saw with the metadoodles and with Da Vinci, and even in our own doodles, it can be a form of letting go of our more analytical, linear style thinking and getting more into a more open thought pattern and process. So if you're stuck on something, take a couple of minutes, doodle, and see what comes out of it, because that relaxation, it gives your brain a moment to unfocus. This is a concept from Pillay. It gives you a couple of minutes to unfocus and lets your DMN kind of get into work there, so that you're not thinking clenched up as deeply about that one particular idea. And you can take doodling and just drawing for about, it can be anywhere from a couple of minutes to half an hour, to make your brain relax and unfocus and get some separation in your thoughts and sort things out. Sort of like how when you're really stressed out and you can't think of a word, but it comes to you a few hours later, it's that same mental process. It can actually, in several studies, it was proven to improve your memory. So it not only gives you a visual image to look at, or if you're an auditory learner, it lets you translate something into a visual image. Kinesthetic, it gives you something to do. And visual learner, obviously, it gives you something to look at. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways it can be really assistive. And honestly, I would like to remember things better. And that was one of the tricks that our chemistry professor used, was it helped her remember. So if you find yourself trying to intake information and you're forgetting it, guess what? Doodle it. Okay, so famous doodlers. We mentioned Da Vinci. Obviously, we've all seen the Google doodles. So in the sense of being a corporate person, Google. Franz Kafka, Tolkien, Queen Victoria. So there's actually a book just about presidential doodles, because around half-ish of our presidents, they were all doodlers. So we have here one of John Adams' doodles. Jefferson really enjoyed architectural doodles. Garfield enjoyed word doodles. Grant obviously did a lot of cubes and lines. His presidency was very stressful. I think he was trying to construct out of a whole new society. So he was obviously drawing a lot of cubes and cubes on cubes, which means that you're trying to construct an idea. A lot of people drew faces. Hoover actually really didn't draw people at all. He mostly drew like Art Deco pieces, which is one of the reasons why they say he didn't notice what was going on with people, because he wasn't paying attention to people. He was paying attention to art and mechanics. Kennedy, as we said, is a big word doodler. So another common one that you would see is his doodling of Fidel Castro's name during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he was using doodling to help sort it out. LBJ was just an interesting doodler. Ronald Reagan doodled a lot of cartoons. At some point, he had thought about doing cartoons for career things. So he obviously drew a lot of people, but there are several books about just presidential doodles. And speaking of politicians and doodling, this actually made the news a couple of years back. And it was all over the original photos from Reuters of Hillary Clinton during a UN Security Council meeting. They actually caught her doodling on her piece of paper. And she tends to draw a lot of swirls, a lot of flowers, a lot of really abstract kind of basic concepts, which means she's doing some complicated thinking here. So drawing on the side of your paper isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could actually be a very good one. Franz Kafka, if you all are familiar with the book The Metamorphosis, where the man becomes the original Animorph and turns into a giant cockroach. Yeah. So he did a lot of surrealist drawings. I think the archive for these is actually in Israel, but a friend of his collected his doodles to have them go along with his writing. And anyone who has sort of that big imaginative outlet, you will often find archives of their doodles. The same with Tolkien. Tolkien actually did a lot of his painting and art and drawing himself. Not for the books, but in the sense of he just did some doodling for personal reasons. And Queen Victoria, the most painted and longest lived up until the present queen monarch, was actually a consummate doodler. And the royal family just released a bunch of her paintings and drawings and doodles from some of her earlier periods. And we often think of her as this very serious, very uptight figure, but oftentimes the doodles of famous people are very snarky and kind of sarcastic. Hers tend to be a little bit more formal, but it's good to know that really famous people who are really well known or big contributors to society, you know, that they doodle when they're trying to figure out something really difficult. Like the office of the presidency is one of the most difficult jobs to have. And yet almost half of our presidents, as far as we know, have documented doodles of all varieties. And even Google, which has its own archive of what it calls doodles, it's now considered a privilege to have a Google doodle, you know, made about you. And there's actually a few websites that keep track of the people who have been included in Google Doodles, like Charles Adams and Bram Stoker. And it's this idea of taking something and making it informational and making it fun. Okay, so methods of doodling. You can do very artistic doodling. There are a couple books that I would recommend for this. Girl Plus Pen is very good, as is Doodles Unleashed. Both of them focus on what's called mixed media doodling, which means that they might start out with ink and then move into watercolors or fabric or bits and scraps of paper. You don't have to pick just one spot and one specific way to do your doodles. It's a large part of their point. You can actually take something, do a doodle enlarge it in a computer program, and then take it to a next level. We discussed Zentangles because they are really popular right now, and they are something that you can learn how to do from beginning to end. We talked about meditative doodling. I would highly recommend looking at some of the YouTube videos out there online for meditative doodling. And you can also learn how to do cartoon type doodles. That's something that's very frequent, is how do I draw people? How do I draw animals? How do I draw, you know, a snake from beginning to end? Well, it starts out as just a squiggle, right? And then a circle, and then a squiggle, and then a point. And then you add some circles for eyes. And there are a ton of books that guide you through just those sort of basic doodles, how to doodle animals, how to doodle people, how to make your own info doodles. If you're interested in that, Suni Brown's book is really great. She does her basic beginning to end on how to just do basic styles of doodling. I do have a list of the resources that I used here for you guys if you want to take a look, and some books from our collection that you can check out. I want to ask if you guys have any questions. Are there specific types of doodling you think you might do? Feel free to place them in chat. I know for me, I'm probably going to look at getting into some more Zen doodling, since my doodles tend to be very cartoonish and kind of abstract. And we can also consider graffiti as a form of doodling, you know? Okay, so bullet journaling. I am so glad that you asked, Ken. What is bullet journaling? So we have had some live presentations about this in the past, but a bullet journal takes the idea of using a journal that's less structured, but it has these dots in the background, and it lets you construct what you want it to look like. So here we see doodles of the weather. We see filled in patterns, can be another type of doodling. We see really ornate handwriting here. You know, this one is absolutely covered in different doodles of planets and telescopes and that sort of thing. So it's a way of keeping track of information. It often functions as a calendar, and you can use it to track different things. You can use it to mean different things in terms of understanding. You can use it to keep track. And oftentimes it relies a lot on images and visual language. So when we're talking about doodling and when we're talking about bullet journaling, we're actually talking about visual language. If you're thinking about, say, in your head, hieroglyphics, that's a form of visual language in a way. If we're talking about putting together images, so, you know, if you see if you see the presidential seal, right, you know who's going to walk through that door, technically, in that circumstance. So these are all forms of what's called visual literacy, meaning that you can take an image and interpret it and have a decent understanding of what it means. And that's something actually that emojis do a lot, is we can combine different emojis to mean different feelings, thoughts, Some people use memes even to do that, and this forms a part of our visual language. So bullet journaling, it's a lot like having a planner and a journal sort of together in one, but it integrates things like font doodling. We saw with some of the fancy handwriting. It integrates things like representation through charts and pictograms. So doodling can take a whole lot of different forms, and it's something that you can actually integrate into your classwork as well, or your personal life and trying to keep track of things. There's even people who keep just doodle journals where they will collect the doodles that they've made and keep track of them so that they know, okay, you know, this is something that I want to work with in the future. Sort of using their drawings as a way to keep track of parts of their life. I hope that answered the question about bullet journals, Ken. Does anyone else have more questions? Oh, yes, quad pad paper. Yeah, it's very similar to the quad paper, except it's just basically dots instead of lines. You are right about the shared sketches, that, you know, that was something that you got together with your fellows and you really enjoyed, and that good ideas came from those shared sketches. That's actually something that Sunny Brown touches on in her book about the doodle revolution, is using these info doodles within the setting of meetings and group get-togethers so that we can have a visual representation of where people want an idea to go from just shared images. And thank you so much, guys. This will be accessible on our YouTube channel, and it will also be accessible on our Life page. I really appreciate you guys coming out for Life at Noon. And I'm really excited. Next week, we are having a friend of mine who is also a very talented musician. Gillian will be with us, and she will be taking us through some musical fun facts and quirks. And we're going to learn a lot about music next week. So do join us next week for Life at Noon.